January 1943, somewhere in the frozen hell outside Leningrad. Soviet tankers stand in a circle around a mechanical beast they've never seen before. It's massive, angular, intimidating. A German Tiger I tank, captured intact after its crew abandoned it in the chaos of retreat. The men don't speak, they just stare. One lieutenant finally breaks the silence, his breath fogging in the Arctic air. "Comrades, what kind of monster is this? Before we dive into this incredible story, let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you've ever heard about the moment that changed tank warfare forever. What happened next in that snowy clearing would reshape the entire Soviet military doctrine, influence the outcome of World War II, and teach the world a lesson about engineering, strategy, and the dangerous seduction of perfection. This isn't just a story about tanks, it's about hubris versus humility, complexity versus reliability, the illusion of invincibility versus the brutal honesty of mud, snow, and war. Stay with me, because what the Soviets discovered inside that Tiger would shock even their most experienced engineers, and the conclusions they drew would echo through military history for generations. The Tiger I wasn't just a tank, it was a statement. When Nazi Germany unleashed it in 1942, it represented the pinnacle of German engineering philosophy. Overwhelming firepower, impenetrable armor, technological supremacy. Its 80 mm gun could penetrate any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2 kilometers. Its frontal armor, 100 mm thick, was virtually immune to most anti-tank weapons of the era. German propaganda called it unbesiegbar, unconquerable. Panzer crews who got assigned to Tigers felt like gods. And in early encounters they had every reason to feel that way. British Churchills, American Shermans, Soviet T-34s, they all burned when they faced the Tiger. The psychological impact was devastating. Allied tankers developed what historians would later call Tiger fear, a paralyzing dread that made men hesitate, make mistakes, die. But here's what most people don't know. By January 1943, Soviet intelligence was desperate for one thing above all else: an intact Tiger. Not destroyed, not partially burned, intact. They needed to understand the beast that was tearing through their armored divisions. And when that opportunity finally came near Leningrad, when a Tiger broke down during a German withdrawal and its crew had no choice but to abandon it, the Soviets moved with surgical precision. Elite recovery teams, engineers, and high-ranking military observers converged on that frozen field within hours. What they were about to discover would change everything. Senior Lieutenant Dmitry Oskin was among the first Soviet officers to physically enter the captured Tiger. Years later, he would describe that moment with an almost religious reverence mixed with confusion. "We expected something alien," he recalled. "Some revolutionary technology we couldn't comprehend. What we found was more disturbing. It was brilliant, yes, but also fragile." The engineering team that descended on the Tiger was led by some of the Soviet Union's most accomplished minds. Veterans who had designed the T-34, men who understood armor, mobility, firepower, and most importantly, the realities of mass production under wartime conditions. They came with measuring tools, cameras, notebooks, and an open directive from Stalin himself. "Learn everything. Tell me why we're losing to this machine." For 3 days and nights, in temperatures that reached -30 degrees Celsius, Soviet engineers dissected the Tiger like surgeons examining a patient. They measured armor thickness at every angle. They photographed welding seams. They tested the suspension. They examined the transmission, the engine, the gun mounting system. And slowly a disturbing picture began to emerge. Yes, the Tiger was magnificent. But magnificence, they realized, wasn't the same as effectiveness, not in the kind of war they were fighting. But before the engineers could even finish their initial assessment, the confrontation began. Not with bullets, with pride. Enter the antagonists of our story. A collection of voices, perspectives, and egos that would clash violently with the humble truth the engineers were uncovering. First, there were the Soviet military hardliners, generals who had watched their tanks burn by the dozens and now demanded, "Why can't we build this? Why can't we match German engineering?" These men saw the Tiger and wanted their own Tigers, bigger if possible, heavier, more powerful. To them, anything less was admitting inferiority. Their spokesman was Major General Fyodor Petrov, a decorated tank commander whose division had lost 67 T-34s to just 4 Tigers in a single engagement near Kursk. Petrov was traumatized, angry, and he made his position clear in the first meeting with the engineering team. "Gentlemen," Petrov slammed his fist on the table where the Tiger's blueprints were spread. "Our men are dying because we send them into battle in inferior machines. This He jabbed at the Tiger's schematic. This is what a tank should be. This is what we should be building. I don't want excuses about production capacity or resource limitations. I want Soviet Tigers. I want our boys to have the same advantage the fascists have. The room fell silent. The tension was immediate and palpable. Sitting across from Petrov was the man who would become the quiet hero of this story. Chief Engineer Nikolai Kotin, the mind behind the KV series of heavy tanks. A man in his early 40s with wire-rimmed glasses, ink-stained fingers, and a reputation for brutal honesty that had nearly gotten him arrested during Stalin's purges. Kotin didn't look like a warrior. He looked like a schoolteacher, which made what happened next even more remarkable. Kotin removed his glasses, cleaned them slowly, with a handkerchief, and spoke in a voice so calm it somehow amplified the weight of his words. General Petrov, with all due respect to your service and your losses, you're asking for the wrong thing. The room gasped. You didn't contradict generals in Stalin's Soviet Union. Not if you valued your life. Petrov's face turned crimson. Excuse me? You're asking us to build German tanks, Kotin continued, seemingly oblivious to the danger he was courting. But we are not Germans. And this... He tapped the Tiger blueprint. This is not a weapon designed for the war we're fighting. Another antagonist entered the fray. Colonel Engineer Sergei Makonin, a man who had studied in Germany before the war, who admired German precision, German methodology, German excellence. Makonin had been lobbying for Soviet tank design to adopt more German principles, tighter tolerances, more sophisticated systems, higher quality standards. Chief Engineer Kotin. Makonin's voice dripped with condescension. Are you seriously suggesting that we should ignore what is clearly the most advanced tank in the world? That we should continue producing our crude, simple machines while the enemy fields technological marvels? Isn't that precisely the kind of backward thinking that Stalin himself has condemned? The political weapon had been deployed. In 1943, Soviet Union being called backward in a meeting that would certainly be reported to the NKVD was potentially fatal. Eyes turned to Kotin. How would this humble engineer, this quiet man who preferred equations to politics, respond to a challenge that threatened not just his professional opinion, but potentially his life? Kotin stood up slowly. He walked to the Tiger blueprint and placed his hand flat on it. Comrades, let me tell you what we learned from examining this masterpiece of German engineering. His voice remained calm, almost professorial, but there was steel underneath. The Tiger has 26,000 man-hours of production. Time. The T-34 has 3,000. The Tiger's transmission requires 18 forward gears and 6 reverse gears, operated by a system so complex that it takes weeks to train a crew to use it properly. The T-34's transmission can be understood by a farmer in an afternoon. That's because our tank is primitive, Makonin interrupted. Because we cut corners. No. Kotin's voice sharpened just slightly. Because our tank is honest. The word hung in the air. Honest. What a strange word to use for a weapon of war. Petrov leaned forward. Explain yourself, engineer. And so Kotin did. For the next 20 minutes he walked that room full of generals, colonels, political officers, and engineers through the ugly truth hidden inside the Tiger's magnificent exterior. Gentlemen, the Tiger weighs 54 tons. Its ground pressure is higher than a T-34 because its tracks, while wide, cannot compensate for its enormous weight. We tested it in the mud outside Leningrad. It sank. It couldn't move. The crew would have to wait for recovery vehicles or abandon it. The T-34, at 26 tons, simply drove through the same mud. He pointed to another section of the blueprint. The Tiger's Maybach HL230 engine produces 700 horsepower, impressive, but it's a 12-cylinder gasoline engine of extraordinary complexity. It overheats in summer, it refuses to start in extreme cold without extensive preheating. It requires high-octane fuel that Germany is already struggling to produce. The T-34's V2 diesel engine is simpler, more reliable, runs on anything that burns, and in our testing, it started in -40-degree weather with no preparation. But Kotin wasn't done. He was building to something, and everyone in the room could feel it. The Tiger's interleaved road wheel system. He pulled out photographs showing the Tiger's distinctive overlapping wheels. It's brilliant engineering for weight distribution, but it's a nightmare in Russian winter. Snow and mud pack between the wheels and freeze solid overnight. In the morning, the tank cannot move until crews spend hours with blowtorches thawing the suspension. We documented one case where a Tiger was immobilized for 16 hours because of frozen road wheels. In those same conditions, T-34 crews simply started their engines and drove. The silence in the room was deafening. Kotin could see he was breaking through, but the hardliners weren't ready to yield. Petrov, to his credit, was listening now rather than just reacting. But another voice emerged, this one belonging to People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs Representative Ivan Volkov, a political officer whose job was to ensure ideological purity and who saw Kotin's defense of simple Soviet design as potentially defeatist, potentially counter-revolutionary. Comrade Kotin, Volkov's voice was soft, dangerous. Some might interpret your enthusiasm for simplicity over sophistication as an excuse for our industrial inadequacies. Some might say you're defending Soviet backwardness rather than pushing for Soviet advancement. Should we tell our tank crews dying against tigers that simplicity is a virtue while they burn? It was a trap, and everyone knew it. Answer wrong, and Kotin could find himself accused of defeatism, of undermining the war effort, of crimes that carried a bullet to the back of the head in the cellars of the Lubyanka. The room held its breath. But Kotin smiled. It wasn't a nervous smile or a defensive smile. It was the smile of a teacher who has been waiting for exactly this question, because it allows him to reveal the lesson's true depth. Comrade Volkov, let me answer your question with numbers. Real numbers from the war we're actually fighting. He pulled out a folder, laid it on the table, and began to present data that would shift the entire debate. In 1942, Germany produced 1,347 tanks of all types. In the same year, the Soviet Union produced 24,446 tanks. This year, 1943, Germany will produce perhaps 6,000 tanks total, including Tigers. We will produce over 20,000, most of them T-34s. Now, gentlemen, let me ask you a question. Would you rather face 100 Tigers with 100 Soviet super heavy tanks that match them in armor and firepower? Or would you rather face those same 100 Tigers with 500 T-34s that can be produced in the same time frame, with the same resources, and repaired in the field by crews with basic tools? Petrov started to speak, stopped, frowned. The mathematics were beginning to penetrate even his trauma-hardened stance. But Kotin wasn't finished. The Tiger has a transmission failure rate of 35% after 100 kilometers of operation. The T-34's failure rate is 8% after 500 kilometers. The Tiger requires a specialized recovery vehicle, a FAMO tractor, to tow it when it breaks down. The T-34 can be towed by another T-34, by a truck, sometimes even by horses. The Tiger requires trained engineers and specialized parts to repair in the field. The T-34 can be repaired by its own crew with a hammer, a wrench, and determination. He pulled out photographs showing Tiger tanks abandoned on roadsides, not destroyed by enemy fire but simply broken, left behind because German logistics couldn't keep up with their maintenance demands. Gentlemen, we captured this Tiger not because we outfought it. We captured it because it broke down. The crew didn't even try to destroy it properly before fleeing. Why? Because they're exhausted. Because maintaining Tigers is breaking their armies back. Because perfection is the enemy of effectiveness. Colonel McConan shook his head, unwilling to surrender his position. You're talking about manufacturing and logistics, Engineer Kotin. But in battle, one Tiger is worth 10 T-34s. Any tanker will tell you that. The kill ratio proves it. Does it? Kotin's voice was sharp now, the patience wearing thin because lives were at stake, and misconceptions were killing his countrymen. Comrade Colonel, you're correct that in a one-on-one engagement, the Tiger almost always wins. Its armor is thicker, its gun more powerful, its optics superior. But war isn't a series of one-on-one duels. War is chaos. The Tiger's advantage evaporates when 6 T-34s attack from multiple directions simultaneously. The Tiger's advantage disappears when our tanks can respond to battlefield developments in hours, while German heavy tanks take days to reposition because they can't cross small bridges, can't navigate forest roads, can't be transported by rail without partial disassembly. He walked back to the table, and now his voice dropped, becoming almost intimate, drawing everyone in. But here's what truly matters. The insight that changes everything. The Germans built the Tiger to be invincible. They designed it to be the perfect predator. And in their pursuit of that perfection, they created something that cannot adapt. The Tiger is so heavy it can't cross most bridges in Russia. Its fuel consumption is so enormous that each tank requires a convoy of support vehicles. Its crew training is so extensive that losing a Tiger crew is a strategic disaster because replacements take months to train properly. The Tiger is a marvel, yes, but it's a fragile marvel. It's a sword made of glass, beautiful, deadly when swung correctly, but shatter it once, and it's gone forever. The metaphor landed. Kotin could see it in their faces. Even Volkov, the political officer, looked thoughtful rather than hostile now. But the engineer wasn't done. He had one more revelation, one more twist that would bring this whole confrontation to its climax. 3 days ago, Kotin said quietly, I personally crawled inside this captured tiger. I sat in the commander's seat. I looked through the optics. I touched the controls. And do you know what I realized? The Germans built this tank afraid. Afraid? Petrov looked confused. The tigers terrorize our forces and you say they were built afraid? Yes, afraid. They built the tiger because they're afraid of Soviet numerical superiority. They built it because they're afraid they can't match our production. They built it because they're afraid of the T-34's mobility and mechanical reliability. The tiger is a defensive weapon dressed up as offensive superiority. It's heavy because they're afraid of our guns. It's complex because they're afraid of simplicity. It's expensive because they're afraid that only expense equals quality. And that fear is their weakness. Kotin pulled out one more document, and his voice became gentle. The voice of a teacher who genuinely wants his students to understand. Comrades, the Soviet Union isn't perfect. Our industry was devastated by the German invasion. We're producing tanks in factories that were reassembled in the Urals by workers who are cold and hungry and exhausted. We don't have Germany's precision tooling, their trained machinists, their century of industrial excellence, but we have something they don't have. And what is that? Even Volkov was leaning forward now. We have humility. We know our limitations and we design for them. The T-34 isn't simple because we can't build something complex. It's simple because simplicity is the highest form of sophistication when you're fighting a war across the largest country on Earth, in the harshest conditions on the planet, with an army of farmers and workers who need to be turned into effective tankers in weeks, not months. The T-34 is brilliant precisely because it's honest about what war really requires. The room was absolutely still. The tension that had been ready to explode into political denunciations, career destruction, possibly worse, had transformed into something else. Understanding. But Kotin had one final revelation, one last surprise that would cement his argument. He walked to the corner of the room and pulled a canvas cover off an object no one had paid attention to. It was a component from the Tiger, a piece of the transmission. This, Kotin held it up, is a precision-engineered gear from the Tiger's transmission. Look at the machining. Perfect. Flawless. Now look at this. He produced a similar gear from a T-34. Rougher finishing, visible tool marks. If you measured them, the German gear would have tolerances measured in microns. Ours would be measured in fractions of millimeters. The German gear is objectively superior, but he dropped both gears on the Aussie metal table with a clang. The Tiger's gear broke after 60 kilometers of operation in Russian mud. The T-34's gear, this crude gear, is still functioning after 2,000 kilometers. Why? Because the German gear was manufactured to such tight tolerances that when mud and grit inevitably entered the transmission, it couldn't accommodate the contamination. It seized. The T-34's gear, with its rougher tolerances, allows particles to pass through. It's not perfect, but it survives. That is the difference between engineering for perfection and engineering for reality. The revelation hung in the air like artillery smoke. Petrov stood up slowly, walked to the gears, picked up the T-34 component, turned it over in his hands. When he spoke, his voice had changed entirely. Engineer Kotin, I lost 67 tanks, good men, friends, and I wanted revenge. I wanted invincibility. I wanted to never feel helpless again. But you're telling me that invincibility was always an illusion. Not an illusion, General. A trap. The Germans fell into the trap of believing that if they just made their tanks perfect enough, they could overcome any disadvantage. But war doesn't reward perfection. War rewards adaptability, reliability, numbers, and speed. We can't outperfect the Germans, but we can outthink them. We can outproduce them. We can outlast them. And we can do it with tanks that our soldiers can actually maintain, that our factories can actually build, that our logistics can actually support. Colonel Makonin, who had been silent for several minutes, finally spoke, and his voice carried the weight of a man confronting his own misconceptions. I studied in Germany. I admired their engineering so much. I wanted us to be like them. But you're saying that's the wrong aspiration entirely. Kotin's face softened. Comrade Colonel, German engineering is remarkable. But it's engineering for a different context, a different nation, a different war. They have excellent roads, short supply lines, highly trained crews, abundant resources for maintenance. We have mud, vast distances, conscripted crews, and factories still recovering from evacuation. If we try to fight their way, with their tools, we'll lose. But if we fight our way, with our tools, adapted to our reality, we've already seen the results. At Stalingrad, at Kursk, wherever German armor gets bogged down in our conditions, the T-34 swarms overcome the Tigers. Not through superior engineering, but through superior strategy. The political officer Volkov cleared his throat. Everyone tensed again. His word could still destroy Kotin regardless of the technical arguments. Engineer Kotin, when I entered this meeting, I was prepared to write a very different report. I was prepared to document defeatism and technological conservatism. But I'm beginning to understand something more profound here. You're not defending backwardness. You're articulating a different kind of advancement. The advancement of wisdom over pride. Kotin inclined his head respectfully but said nothing. He'd learned when to let silence do the work. Volkov continued. What you're describing, this philosophy of honest engineering, of designing for reality rather than ideology, it's almost counterintuitive. We're taught that Soviet industry must always advance, must always innovate, must always reach for the highest achievement. But you're saying that sometimes the highest achievement is knowing what not to build. Exactly. Kotin's voice was warm now, the defensive edge gone. The Germans are enslaved by their own excellence. Every Tiger is a strategic asset they can't afford to lose. Every breakdown is a crisis. Every engagement is a gamble with irreplaceable resources. Meanwhile, we're fighting with tools we can afford to lose, afford to crash, afford to wear out and replace. There's a terrible liberation in that. Our tank crews know that if their T-34 is destroyed, there will be another one. Tomorrow. That knowledge makes them braver, more aggressive, more willing to take risks that win battles. Petrov sat down heavily. When he spoke, his voice was raw with emotion. My men who died, they didn't die because our tanks were inferior. They died because war is hell and people die in war. But their deaths weren't meaningless because our strategy is sound. That's what you're telling me. General, your men died heroes fighting the most advanced tank in the world with weapons that were good enough. And good enough in sufficient numbers beats perfection in limited numbers. That's not cold comfort. But it's true comfort. The mathematics are on our side. The strategy is on our side. And ultimately, history will be on our side. The transformation in the room was palpable. What had begun as a confrontation between arrogant certainty and humble truth had evolved into something more profound. A collective awakening to the nature of their war and the path to victory. But Kotin had one more surprise, one final revelation that would seal this moment in history. Gentlemen, he said quietly, I need to tell you something personal. Something I haven't shared in any official report. Everyone leaned in. Before I became an engineer, I wanted to be a teacher. I believed that education was the highest calling. My father was a farmer, my mother couldn't read. They scraped together every ruble to send me to technical school. And do you know what my father told me the day I left? For Leningrad? No one spoke. The moment felt sacred. He said, Kolya, don't fall in love with complicated answers. The soil doesn't care about fancy theories. It cares about rain and sun and the right seeds planted at the right time. Be smart enough to stay simple. I didn't understand him then. I thought he was just a peasant who didn't understand the modern world. But now, after designing tanks, after watching them fight, after examining this Tiger, I finally understand what he meant. Sophistication isn't about complexity. It's about finding the elegant solution that actually works in the world as it is, not as we wish it were. The room was silent, but it was a different silence now. Not the tense silence of confrontation, but the profound silence of revelation. Kotin continued, When I sat in that Tiger's commander seat, I didn't feel envy. I felt sadness. Sadness for the German engineers who clearly poured their genius into creating something that can't fulfill its purpose. Sadness for the German tank crews who have to maintain these temperamental machines while our crews are sleeping. And gratitude, deep gratitude, that our Soviet design philosophy, born from necessity and hardship, happened to be exactly what was needed to win this war. Petrov stood up and extended his hand to Kotin. Engineer, I owe you an apology. I came here demanding you build better tanks. But you've taught me that we already have the right tanks. Now I need to learn how to use them better. Makonin approached next, his earlier condescension completely gone. Comrade Kotin, would you be willing to develop a training manual for commanders? Something that articulates this philosophy? Because if we understand why our tanks are designed the way they are, we can use them more effectively. I would be honored, Colonel. Even Volkov, the political officer, seemed moved. Engineer Kotin, your father was a wise man. And so are you. This conversation will be reported to Moscow, but not as I initially intended. I will recommend that your design philosophy be studied and implemented across our entire military-industrial complex. Because what you've articulated here isn't just about tanks. It's about how we approach every challenge in this war. Kotin felt his eyes moisten. He'd expected denunciation, possibly arrest. Instead, he'd found understanding. But he had one more thing to say, one more lesson to share. Comrades, there's a reason I fought so hard for you. To understand this, it's not just about tanks, it's about our nation. The Soviet Union has always been dismissed by our enemies as backward, crude, unsophisticated, and sometimes we've believed them. We've felt inferior. But what if our supposed crudeness is actually our strength? What if the simplicity born from our industrial limitations is precisely the sophistication needed for total war? What if humility about our capabilities is the foundation of strategy that works? The Germans thought they could crush us with superior technology. But they forgot that war is fought in the mud, not in engineering textbooks. And in the mud, the simple survives while the perfect perishes. He gestured to the Tiger blueprint one last time. Let this be our lesson. We won't build Soviet Tigers. We'll build more T-34s, better T-34s, faster T-34s. We'll build tanks that Russian winters can't stop, that Ukrainian mud can't swallow, that Belarusian forests can't trap. We'll build tanks that farmers turned soldiers can maintain, that factory workers still learning their trade can produce, that stretched supply lines can actually deliver. We'll build tanks that are honest about what war requires, and we'll bury the Tigers under an avalanche of that honest steel. The meeting ended not with recriminations but with handshakes, with newfound respect, with a shared understanding that would ripple through Soviet military doctrine for the rest of the war and beyond. The captured Tiger would eventually be tested extensively, its secrets fully catalogued. But the real discovery had already happened in that room. The discovery that wisdom beats arrogance, that humility beats pride, that understanding your limitations and designing for them beats pursuing perfection you can't sustain. In the weeks and months that followed, Soviet tank production accelerated. The T-34 was refined but never overcomplicated. New models like the T-34-85 added better guns and improved turrets, but always maintained the core philosophy: reliability, producibility, repairability. By the end of 1943, the Soviet Union was producing tanks at a rate that Germany couldn't match even in peacetime, let alone while under siege. By 1944, the tide had definitively turned. German Panthers and Tigers were still formidable individually, but they were drowning in waves of Soviet armor that just kept coming, kept fighting, kept overwhelming German positions through sheer numbers, tactical flexibility, and operational endurance. Kotin would survive the war, his reputation secured not just as an engineer but as a philosopher of warfare. His principle, designed for reality, not fantasy, would influence Soviet military and industrial policy for decades. The T-34 would be produced in numbers exceeding 84,000 units, becoming the most produced tank in history and the symbol of Soviet victory. Meanwhile, Germany would produce fewer than 1,400 Tigers across all variants, each one a masterpiece, each one a strategic burden. The Tiger's reputation as the most fearsome tank of World War II endures, and rightfully so. But history's verdict is clear. Fear doesn't win wars. Reliability, adaptability, and the wisdom to build what you can actually sustain, those win wars. The Germans built the perfect predator. The Soviets built the perfect answer to perfection. Not another predator, but a pack of wolves that could hunt together, fall and rise again, and never stop coming. The lesson echoes far beyond tank warfare or World War II. In every field, business, technology, engineering, life itself, we're tempted by the seduction of perfection. We chase the ideal solution, the flawless product, the unbeatable strategy. But perfection is fragile. Perfection can't adapt. Perfection breaks under real-world stress and demands constant maintenance. Meanwhile, solutions designed with honest assessment of limitations, with humility about resources and conditions, with flexibility built into their foundation, those solutions survive, evolve, and ultimately triumph. The captured Tiger sits today in the Kubinka Tank Museum outside Moscow, a monument to German engineering prowess and a testament to why prowess alone doesn't determine outcomes. Visitors marvel at its massive gun, its thick armor, its imposing presence. But the historians and engineers who truly understand that moment in 1943 look at it differently. They see not a monster, but a lesson in metal, that the greatest victories come not from building what cannot fail, but from building what can fail and still achieve the mission. That true strength comes from knowing your weaknesses and designing around them. That humility, not arrogance, is the foundation of lasting success. So when you face your own tigers, the impossible challenges, the overwhelming obstacles, the competitors who seem invincible, remember the Soviet engineers in that frozen field. Don't try to outperfect the competition. Don't chase invincibility. Instead, be honest about your reality. Build for the conditions you face, not the conditions you wish you faced. Be simple where simplicity serves. Be complex only where complexity adds real value. And above all, remember that sustained effort with good enough tools beats sporadic genius with perfect tools every single time.